This is Fat Little Acorns, a Not Alone Origins story, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by James Patrick Cronin. Realisation. At the end of a day John Cole had looked forward to for several years, he couldn't wait to get home and put the whole thing behind him. Throughout his 18 years, young John had been told by those around him that he could be anything he wanted to be, that hard work paid off, that highs would follow lows, and he would get what he deserved when all was said and done. Today, on the way home from his entrance interview at the nation's leading university, John Cole no longer held such foolish and childish illusions. He had dressed well, practiced his enunciation, and mastered the key anecdotes and details that he had been told to focus on by the well-meaning teacher who pushed him into the ambitious interview. John's existing and predicted grades certainly justified the faith others had placed in him, but just a few hours after the interview's conclusion, he was lamenting his own stupidity for buying into it. Universities like that weren't for people like him, as the expressions on every face he spoke to throughout the day had made only too clear, even when their owners were too cowardly to state it outright. The subtext behind questions over what kind of work his father did and where he planned to spend the summer weren't lost on John. There was no legacy connection and no ski chalet in France. Not in his life. John's summer would be spent in his grandfather's two-bedroom terraced house in Sheffield, the only home he had known with the only guardian he could remember. It hadn't even just been the prejudicial subtext behind the questions or the telling holes in John's replies, he reflected ruefully as the world sped by his window. It had been the accents, too. This point came racing into his mind as a ticket inspector drew near. The man, who sounded like a North Londoner and looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, was having some difficulties with a trio of younger men. The obstinate group by no means fitted the stereotype of disruptive yobs and were instead exhibiting an unmistakable air of superiority. "Oh, for goodness sake," was the first phrase that caught John's ear, spoken through gritted teeth at high volume. When John turned around, he saw that the affronted passenger had swept back blonde hair and wore a woolen sweater with the sleeves rolled to his elbow. "This is absolutely ridiculous," a second voice added, its owner decked out in a designer polo shirt. "No way to treat the people who pay your paltry wages," the third chimed in. John couldn't see this man, but his mind by now came up with a fairly strong image. To John's working-class ears, all three sounded like they had just stepped out of Pride and Prejudice, and they clearly carried themselves with far too much of both. "One of these tickets is for yesterday," the inspector stated matter-of-factly. He was holding his patience well, John thought, especially after the comment about his wages, but his own voice was growing more insistent. "So right now you can show me a valid ticket, you can pay for one, or you can get off my train." "Your train? How rich. I want to speak to your manager," the blond man demanded. The inspector sighed. "This ain't a supermarket. You're now obstructing my work, which is an offense as per the—" "Just look for the new one," the man in the polo shirt suggested to his friend, sighing it out. "He's not worth this trouble." While holding intense eye contact with the inspector, the blond man lifted his wallet back on the table in front of him. He then flipped through a small pile of cards and found the correct ticket. "There," he grunted. "You might not be able to say the same, but I'm hardly going to risk a criminal record for £30 now, am I?" "Enjoy the rest of your journey," the inspector said, forcing a smile and making a point of not bothering to closely examine, much less punch, the ticket. "You're not even going to check it? Time-wasting idiot," the blond man snapped. His friends cooled him down with sycophantic utterances of, "He's not worth it," and "You're better than him." John held his ticket out as the inspector passed, causing no similar disruption. "Cheers," he said, drawing a polite nod. For the remainder of his journey back to Sheffield, John wished with every passing second that he had some headphones or even earplugs to blank out the table of self-important toffs whose voices rose above every other. They annoyed him more today than would normally have been the case, due not only to his already low mood, but more specifically because the voices reminded him of his interviewers and those of several other interviewees he had met during the day. John's grandfather, who grew up in the west of Scotland, had previously made the point that he would have once linked posh accents to sports like cricket and rugby. As an adopted Yorkshireman, he rarely tired of laughing about how far that ended up being from the truth, and he had used this example to advise John not to judge books by the covers that surrounded them or words by the accents that tinted them. But emotion ran higher than reason today, as it so often did for the hot-headed John Cole, and when the train reached his stop he couldn't help but accidentally spill most of his can of Coke onto the blond man's woolen sweater. "Oh, I'm so sorry," John said, pausing to glance down for only a second. "Prick." John didn't have to say anything for his grandfather to know that the interview hadn't gone well, or at least to know that John didn't think it had. He nevertheless asked for a full rundown, hoping the grandson in whom he held so much pride might have been overstating one particular moment or comment. As John sat down on the faded armchair and talked through as much as he could remember, his grandfather's hopes slowly and surely faded. The youngster had excelled in the various school subjects which tended to give applicants the best chance of acceptance into a coveted business program, but the snippets John shared from the interview left little doubt in his grandfather's mind that the next news they heard from his university of choice wouldn't be good. Aside from the comments and implications John had already reflected on during his long journey home, relaying it all now brought back another thinly veiled comment about his weight. The interviewer stated that the university placed a high value on healthy pursuits, leading into a question about John's interests in that area. As a rather portly young man, to put it kindly, John could read between the lines easily enough. If he hadn't been able to tell from the words alone, the tone would have sealed it. These few examples were but the tip of the iceberg, with the interviewer having muttered, twitched his nose, and taken notes on his paper when John gave certain responses. On more than one occasion, John's accent, no stronger than anyone else's in his area, had led the interviewer to furrow his brow and sometimes even state outright that he couldn't understand a few words. The man's description of John's accent as rather rustic spoke volumes, and his concluding remark of, "I hope you've enjoyed your day," absolutely sealed it as far as John's grandfather was concerned. Never one to mince his words, the old man saw no sense in doing so now. "They've got boxes to tick, son. So many interviewees from certain areas, certain schools, certain demographics. I thought your credentials would be enough to give you a fair hearing, but people like that can't see and hear past where you came from. I had the same thing, just wasn't as smart as you, so it never really hurt. But you can show them. You can show them all, son. Keep working hard, keep working smart, and you'll make it to where you want to go. You know there's always money in roofing, and I can always get you a—" "I want more than roofing," John sighed. "I was in the business for 40 years, and it always kept a roof over our heads," his grandfather replied with a wink, chuckling at his own joke. He turned slightly more serious. "We always had what we needed. Clothes, a car, football at the weekend. And look, I got my clock." John glanced at the mantelpiece where a gold carriage clock had held pride of place since he was a young child. "Granddad, when I'm 79, I want more than a clock above the fire." "I know, son," the old man nodded, "and you'll get it. I wasn't as smart as you. I didn't have all that business, what do they call it, acumen. But you can build a business in roofing, your own business. You can have vans, staff, accountants. You can buy a suit and sit in an office if that's what you want, and the money will always funnel back to you. You don't need their approval. One day they'll answer to you." These closing words echoed in John's mind, and in that moment he made a decision. The spoiled trio on the train, the judgmental university admissions officer. One day, they would answer to him. Whatever it took, he would see to that. Threshold. Some 15 years after his university disappointment, John Cole had succeeded in building a one-man operation into one of the biggest roofing businesses in northern England. The increasingly brash man had won few friends along the way, dropping allies and partners like bad habits as soon as their usefulness expired, and he had both worked and lived with a single-minded focus on expansion. To that end, although Cole had incrementally upgraded his vans and everything else required to present an important sense of success, he still lived in the small house he inherited from his late grandfather and still watched the same TV from the same faded armchair. The clock was gone, sold to fund an advertising campaign on local radio that had paid for itself multiple times over. Cole had no regrets about selling the clock, knowing the old man would have supported his doing whatever was necessary to grow the business and wishing only that he could have been around to see it. The senior Cole was buried well and given the send-off he deserved. John saw to that. But discretionary spending had otherwise been kept to almost nothing. One sentence rang as loudly in John's mind today as it had when his grandfather first uttered it, and John now said it aloud to himself every day in the mirror. One day, they'll answer to you. A lot of people did now answer to him. From his direct employees to the materials providers he liked to ruthlessly play off against each other in search of the best price. He was a somebody now, even sometimes asked to speak on panels at trade conventions and on trade-related podcasts. It wasn't enough, though, because the privileged few with the accents he despised were still well out of reach. Cole treated his employees fairly well, if somewhat distantly, and took no joy in bossing them around. Like the tech executives who could show up to meetings in their ripped jeans or the footballers who likewise did as they pleased, Cole was determined to accumulate what some of the American business gurus he looked up to might crudely describe as "fuck you" money. Only then would the right people answer to Cole, the people in whose faces he wanted to rub his ultimate success. Most of Cole's days were exhausting but more or less fulfilling, with each of his major investments and gambles to scale things up, paying off as well as he could reasonably expect. A long-running dispute with the taxman had just gone against him, however, to the tune of several thousand of pounds, and this particular day had proceeded to get worse from there. As he drove home after a particularly infuriating home visit to check on the work of a young apprentice, a comment he heard on the radio acted as the final straw. The drive-time phone-in usually gave him some things to agree with and some to get just the right amount of annoyed about, but on this occasion, one young caller pushed him over the edge. Cole left the motorway at the next exit and called in as soon as he was parked at the service station, at which point he proceeded to launch into what would soon become a viral outburst. His call came in response to an individual who identified himself as a student and made a brief comment before hanging up without engaging any further. I don't have a point of my own on these new immigration proposals you're discussing today. I just want to say that it's about time this station was shut down and all the sad old white van men who make up your audience can spew their racist nonsense somewhere else. None of the nonsense Cole had heard on previous days spurred him into making a call, but he couldn't let this one slide. Not today. We're through now to John from Sheffield, the show's host said, at which point Cole muted his radio and focused solely on the phone. Yeah, I just want to say one thing to that little pillock who called in before the break. The host chuckled. Our switchboard is lighting up over that one, and you're the lucky man, John. Bash on. White van men keep this country moving, Cole began. We're the butt of the joke, but we keep this country moving while the posh boys at the top and the layabouts at the bottom leech off us and the rest of the bloody workforce. Were you listening to that guy? The accent on him. He sounded like an extra from Downton Bloody Abbey. Never worked a day in his life, I'll bet you that. The kind of prat who will march for an increase in the price of petrol to protect some monkey in a Brazilian rainforest without a care to spare for how it impacts the delivery drivers who bring him his quinoa and avocados every weekend. And don't get me started on the bloody immigrants. Don't even get me started. On the other end of the line, the show's host vocally agreed with Cole's sentiment about blue-collar workers. The co-host was less sold, adopting a contrary position, as was his role. He asked what side of the bed Cole had gotten up on that day, and exactly what kind of work he did that was so important to the nation. Cole explained that he was the owner of a tremendously successful roofing company and had been in 2 houses that day doing quality assurance spot checks on his latest young hire. Both jobs were done to a high standard, but both houses had left a sour taste in Cole's mouth. The first, he told the hosts and their millions of listeners, had been a bona fide mansion. He spoke only to the owner's teenage daughter, who answered his knock on the door with a furious complaint that he had interrupted her live stream. He apologized and offered to come back when her parents were home, purely to ask if they'd had any direct interaction with the roofer and how they would rate his service. The girl closed the door in Cole's face without another word, almost but not quite slamming it, and he took several deep breaths to compose himself as he walked past a pink convertible car with a private registration plate. "She's one half of this country's damn problems," he ranted through his phone. "The other." From there, Cole fumed about his experience at a home of a bunch of immigrants from Libya or Somalia or some other place you'd need 30 injections just to survive a week. He once again lamented the relatively expensive car in the driveway, which he assumed had been paid for by the public purse, and what he saw as a fundamentally broken welfare system. "My old granddad could hardly find a care home that would take him when the time came, but we've got money for this guy and his 6 kids. This is supposed to be England, and they're squeezing us out. The politicians at the top are squeezing us with taxes on taxes and taxes, and they're undercutting us with the immigrant labour at every turn. The deck is stacked, and your caller blames hard-working Britons for being pissed off. To hell with that nonsense. This has got to stop." The host thanked Cole for his call, stepping in to cut him off when the tone verged towards the dangerous side of the implicit versus explicit line they liked to straddle. As Cole finished his drive home, however, almost every call that followed included a comment along the lines of, "I want to hear more from John in Sheffield, telling it like it is." He couldn't help but smile at this. The next day, the host opened the show by replaying part of Cole's call and stating that it was already their most shared clip on social media. Ever. Something about Cole struck a chord, with the combination of his forceful mannerisms and populist opinions really winning fans among the show's core demographic. The host invited Cole to phone in again, which he did, with pleasure. In the days that followed, John from Sheffield became a fixture on the show with his 5-minute take on the day's news stories. In the weeks that followed, he began making waves online by expanding his own social media presence and being very precise about which issues to speak out on. With a few well-chosen words, Cole was seeing how easily he could garner many thousands of reactions. Good or bad, the volume didn't lie. A simple post from a former cricketer went viral in itself, with almost 1 million engagements in a single day. "John from Sheffield. I'd vote for him." Many of the replies called out problematic comments from Cole's daily radio monologues, some of which would be deemed by any reasonable person as indefensibly racist in tone, but that didn't matter to him, because for the first time in his life, John Cole saw something other than money as a route to the top. By positioning himself as a man of the people, as a voice for the working man, he now saw a way of filling a huge void in British politics. "One day they'll answer to me," he spoke into his rearview mirror after a particularly explosive anti-immigrant tirade. "Right to the fucking top." Upswing. Within a month of John Cole's first radio appearance on a drive-time talk show, he made his TV debut. As his comments had grown closer to the bone of what was deemed acceptable by broadcasting regulators, this TV appearance came as part of a show on the increasing polarization of political discussion, particularly online. In keeping with both the persona he had cultivated on air and the inherent personality it was based upon, Cole used his brief TV time to spout a handful of rapid-fire incendiary comments about his refusal to pander to either the traders selling his country down the river or the unchecked hordes of unskilled migrants who were only too glad to take job opportunities from the hard-working Britons, as whose champion he positioned himself. Although Cole's identity had become public knowledge just a few days after John from Sheffield first announced himself on the national media radar, A TV appearance brought new levels of attention and somewhat predictable comments about his weight. Always a large man, Cole had put on a further substantial amount of weight since the passing of his grandfather. The old man, curt in his manner but always loving, had once jokingly said to the teenage John that, "From fat little acorns grow the mightiest of all oaks." Now, along with his drive to ensure the right people one day answered to him, Cole sought to prove his grandfather right by showing just how mighty he could be. It didn't take long for offers of representation to come Cole's way. TV appearances combined with social media controversy tended to do that, and he wasted little time in signing a deal with a powerful agent. The agent, Paul Schreiber, was introduced to Cole via the famous ex-cricketer who publicly endorsed him during the early days of his celebrity. Since then, Cole's stock had risen quickly enough that he was now the agent's primary focus. Their deal was simple. Cole would keep doing what he was doing to straddle the line between profitable controversy and damaging outrage, while Schreiber would set up mainstream media opportunities as well as paid promotions and endorsements. Cole signed away 20% of all related income in a deal which he soon quietly regretted as one weighted too far in the agent's favor. The opportunities poured in, however, and Cole tried to tell himself that 80% of a lot was a lot better than 100% of nothing. Less than a year after his radio breakthrough, Cole passed the running of his roofing business over to a team of trusted partners. In the same time frame, he also established himself as the go-to guy whenever a news or discussion show needed someone to fill the role of right-wing commentator, one who was always sure to get people without ever quite saying anything overtly racist or otherwise illegal. John Cole was every TV station's dream. Brash, articulate in a very accessible way, and utterly unflinching in the face of confrontation. On days or nights when major political news broke on any of the topics most associated with Cole's outbursts, which was to say immigration and taxation, stations found themselves in competition for exclusive features. Paul Schreiber was firm in his insistence that Cole should keep himself scarce rather than appear everywhere on the same night, and the fees that networks soon paid in a desperate bid to secure his presence were strong vindication of this approach. In short, the money was almost impossible for Cole to believe relative to how many hours he put into the work. 5 figures often came in for just an hour or so on camera, and it wasn't lost on him that many of his neighbors were lucky to make as much in a whole year. At last, John Cole was beginning to see what life was like on the haves side of the street, after plowing along for so long as a hard-working have-not. Hard-working was one of Cole's favorite words, and one that formed part of the catchphrase he liked to rattle off at least once per appearance when describing what he wanted to see. "A fairer Britain for hard-working Britons." Questions about political aspirations grew in both volume and frequency by the day, and before long Cole was mainly being asked when, rather than if, he was going to take the plunge and stand for Parliament. He coyly swatted such questions away without ever giving a hard no, and many read more into what he didn't say than what he did. With a general election some 14 months away, the timing could hardly have been better. He had just enough time to get a new party off the ground and build the grassroots infrastructure to compete in targeted regions, but not so long that his momentum would fizzle out. Cole's intention was made clear when he invested several £1,000s from his media earnings to bring a political consultant all the way from Italy. This came as a surprise even to Schreiber, who learned about it online rather than directly from Cole. A brief row erupted, ending with Cole breaking off their client-agent relationship and telling Schreiber to make himself scarce. The agent had come to know Cole well enough to know his mind wouldn't be changed, but Schreiber pointedly reminded the would-be politician that their contract entitled him to 20% of all Cole's future media-related income. And that contract was black and white. No two ways about it. Cole knew this, and had for a long time, indeed since almost the beginning. It didn't take long for Cole to learn that the only thing he hated more than paying tax was paying commission, and from a very early stage he began gathering intelligence on both Paul Schreiber and his other clients. During a heated final meeting in Cole's home, Cole ultimately presented a folder full of printed documents and images which laid bare Schreiber's infidelity to his wife and also text-based conversations between the powerful agent and some of his high-profile clients. Cole didn't have to say that some of those messages would have been hugely damaging for the clients if they leaked, or that Schreiber's career would be over since it would seem like his device security had been compromised to facilitate the leaks. The agent was stunned. "You no good piece of shit," he grunted. "You ungrateful, fat fucking—" "You know what I want?" Cole calmly interrupted. "Sign here to annul the contract and we can both move on with our lives. Sure, you'll sleep with one eye open and you'll always be looking over your shoulder, hoping I never decide to screw you anyway, but at least you'll survive the night. Whereas, if I send this to the papers—" The why was no surprise, but Schreiber couldn't stop himself from asking, how? "I paid a PI," Cole said. "He's been on you for most of the year. He's been costing me 20 grand a month, but that's a lot less than 20% of everything forever. See, I knew this day was coming, and here it is." With no choice, Schreiber signed the page and walked away. In a power play typical of the man, Cole ensured that his new political advisor was in the room to see this all play out. The man wasn't too concerned, however, since he was paid up front rather than on a percentage or performance-related basis. Indeed, it heartened him to see how ruthless and scheming John Cole really was. These qualities, above all others, would serve him well in the political realm. Kingmaker. On the night of the most viciously contested general election in living memory, John Cole's recently established British Nationals Unity Party exceeded all expectations to win a full 16% of the national vote and secure 24 seats in Parliament. In any circumstances, this would have been a huge win, but the photo finish between the country's two dominant parties placed the new kid on the block in a position of unprecedented power. Thanks to a textbook populist campaign driven by an Italian maverick who had played a key role in similar success stories back home, John Cole found himself as Westminster's Kingmaker. Cole's position on immigration had been so strong for the past year that both major parties had ended up ceding ground on the issue, fearful of being wiped out in some of the key constituencies where Cole's BNU stood high-profile candidates. These included aging several political figures who had been jettisoned by the mainstream for being too controversial, a prominent TV comedian who felt stifled by the kind of political correctness Cole so successfully rallied against, and a host of ex-sportsmen who enjoyed massive support in their areas and were in some cases worshipped as local heroes. The plan came together brilliantly, but the broader election results came together so well that Cole almost had to pinch himself. Neither of the main parties won enough seats to form a majority government, although the incumbent Prime Minister William Godfrey was only 16 seats away from a working majority that would maintain his position. When news stations called the final result with confidence, but before the final counts were in from some of the more remote constituency, John Cole was the most sought-after man in Whitehall. He spent the night with his Italian advisor in a locked room, running through permutations and planning their next move. The advisor stated plainly that Cole should go straight to Godfrey and tell him what he wanted in exchange for forming a coalition to prop up another Godfrey government. Put simply, Cole wanted to be part of that government as immigration minister. William Godfrey, a relic of the oldest school there was everything John Cole despised. Born into wealth, detached from the real world of life and work, and with an accent to make the royals sound like commoners, Godfrey certainly wasn't the kind of man Cole had ever envisioned himself willingly working with. But that was the key. He would be working with Godfrey, and Godfrey would be working with him. If this was going to happen, it would be no unequal partnership. Cole's party might have been adding only 24 more seats to Godfrey's 200 plus, but right now, they were the most valuable seats of all. "I want to speak to Henarth first," Cole said, referencing Mary Henarth, the leader of Godfrey's opposition. Understandably, his advisor was taken aback. "But why? There is no avenue there. Even if she was willing to work with us, she would need the Scots on side for the numbers to add up, and you know they won't entertain getting into bed with us. Half of their campaigning was counter-programming everything you said. Your name is on half of their leaflets." Cole grinned. "Next time it'll be on all of their bloody leaflets, but this isn't about working with her. It's about playing our hand for every chip it's worth." Shortly after daybreak, John Cole found himself in a room with Mary Henarth and no one else. Henarth didn't know precisely what he wanted, of course, but with things so finely balanced, she was in no position to turn him away. Although she couldn't form a government, even with Cole's help in a coalition, she remained hopeful there was some way of persuading him not to side with Godfrey. She had arguments lined up, like that Cole's base would lose faith if he ingratiated himself with the establishment, and that Godfrey would assume all of Cole's core positions as his own to ensure the BNU was an insignificance by the time the next election rolled around. As it went, however, Cole wasn't there to talk. At least, he wasn't there to talk to Henarth. "What's this about?" she asked as Cole started fiddling with his phone just seconds after sitting down. "If I want you to speak, you'll know," he dismissively replied. "Okay, here we are." To Henarth's confusion, Cole stood up and turned his back to her, then held his phone at arm's length as though ready to take a selfie. Only then did William Godfrey's face appear on the screen, and only then did Mary Henarth realize she was being used as a prop, a bargaining tool in Cole's political maneuvering. At the same moment, Godfrey saw who Cole was with. "Oh, God, John, no. Please, don't tell me you've—" "I'm considering my options," Cole butted in. He took a moment to revel in the fact that Godfrey was all but begging. Indeed, a please from the embattled leader was a rarity, like few others. From just a few meters away, Henarth watched in disbelief. Political discourse had doubtlessly been degraded in recent years, but for a party leader to be behaving so tastelessly and against unwritten protocol was even more difficult to swallow. Cole rapidly ran through his concerns about joining a coalition with Godfrey, surprising Henarth by focusing on the very two she would have raised if Cole had actually been there to talk. "Listen, we'll give you what you need, John," Godfrey promised. "You'll have a profile like never before, and the cabinet position is yours. Immigration Minister John Cole. How does that sound? You'll be driving the agenda, operationally and publicly." "And welfare minister," Cole said tonelessly. "I want one of my men appointed as a welfare minister too. Barnes." Godfrey hesitated. "Well, I can guarantee your role as immigration minister. Anything else is a question for once we—" "It's a yes or no," Cole interjected once more. "It's 5 years with a majority government propped up by my 24 seats, or it's however long you can survive as a minority government hounded by my 24 MPs on all the issues that matter most to your voters. I could be a powerful friend, William. The alternative doesn't make sense." William Godfrey's expression didn't look torn, but he was certainly hesitant. Cole could only imagine how much it irked a polished political aristocrat like Godfrey to be beholden to an overweight upstart from Sheffield, and the discomfort was clear. "Well," Cole pushed. "Okay," Godfrey said. "Immigration Minister Cole, we have ourselves a deal. Now get yourself over here and we'll draft our remarks to make it official. Shall we?" "Most certainly we shall," Cole mimicked. Godfrey's accent and all it represented still ran through him like nails on a chalkboard, but the keys to the kingdom were now tantalizingly close. Within a matter of hours, John Cole would officially be a component of Her Majesty's government. 5 years was a lifetime in politics, and the events of a whirlwind election night left Cole more determined than ever to ensure that one day they all answered to him. "Better luck next time, love," Cole said to the disgusted Mary Henarth as he made his way to the door. "See you across the front benches." In. Of all the Black Swan developments John Cole had dreamed of as opportunities to get closer to Godfrey's position, and thus the office that would one day be rightfully his, an alien cover-up had never come into the equation. Today, though, with William Godfrey's position precarious in light of major strife over his plans to privatize elements of Britain's National Health Service, that very issue had fallen neatly into Cole's lap. The previous night, news had broken about a supposed discovery of alien-related documents in Colorado Springs. Since then, the young man who leaked the documents online had been named as Dan McCarthy, and, more pertinently for Cole and Godfrey, the man whose safe they had supposedly been stolen from had been named as none other than IDA Supremo Richard Walker. As hordes of protesters descended on London for a weekend of chaotic anti-government demonstrations, Godfrey convened a meeting of his cabinet to discuss the best way forward. All were shocked when he raised the prospect of addressing the new alien issue head-on, with a few vocally opposed and most of the others dumbstruck by the very suggestion. Even Cole could hardly believe it. But his mental gears were spinning as soon as the topic came up. It was a ludicrous and nonsensical idea, but one whose exposure as nonsense would weaken Godfrey's already flimsy position and possibly remove the strongest personality in frontline British politics from the equation. This would throw Godfrey's party into disarray and allow Cole's to gain ground. And while it was likely a decade too early for the BNU or Cole himself to look like any kind of credible national option, it would move things in the right direction. And if by some miracle Dan McCarthy's leak proved not to be a hoax, Cole's move to ally himself with Godfrey would pay off for him just as much as Godfrey's move to position himself in opposition to U.S. President Valerie Slater would for Britain's standing in the world. This was a high-risk move for Godfrey, but an easy one for Cole, and he stepped up with the first words of support Godfrey had heard all day. "I think it's a great idea." "At least someone sees sense," Godfrey replied, cursing the other ministers in the room for their cautiousness at best and faithlessness at worst. "It's a mistake," said Diane Logan, Godfrey's deputy prime minister. She chimed in with a shake of the head, and only after many silent urges from the eyes of her colleagues. They all believed that publicly coming out in support of a crazy conspiracy theorist would make the government look like fools, without even considering the diplomatic damage it could do to a crucial transatlantic relationship. But Godfrey's mind was made up. He was going to give a speech which amplified and signal-boosted Dan McCarthy's leak, using the issue as a distraction without quite saying he believed it to be real. "John," Godfrey said, making a point of looking at Logan as he spoke, "how would you like to stand beside me when I make the speech?" Like a child on Christmas unwrapping what he thought was a chocolate selection box, only to find a golden ticket to a chocolate factory, John Cole grinned uncontrollably. This lasted for a few seconds before he gathered his composure. What was truly an act of opportunism had taken the best form possible for Cole, appearing as it did to Godfrey like an act of loyalty. Where others had looked to the floor when their prime minister suggested diving into the murky issue of a U.S. government-driven alien cover-up, Cole had rushed to his side, like the loyal coalition partner he was. From a new de facto spot of second-in-command, John Cole would now only answer to one man. He was no longer just close to Godfrey and the power he held. He was in. Soon, when the time was right and the cards fell in his favor, Cole would seek to ruthlessly assume the spot that was rightfully his, from which everyone, Godfrey and his posh boy accent included, would answer to him. "I would like that very much, sir," Cole said with a sycophantic smile. "When do we start?" Thank you for listening to Fat Little Acorns, a Not Alone Origins story, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by James Patrick Cronin, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Produced by Blue Nose Audio. Production coordination by Candace Lawrence. Post-production by Michael Straza. Copyright 2021 by Craig A. Falconer. All rights reserved.